Howdy, welcome to the Old West Travelers YouTube channel. Today we're heading back to December of 1890 at Fort Yates in North Dakota for today's true tale of the Wild West. If this is your first time here, I'm your host Scott Winchester, and the Old West Traveler is all about true stories of cowboys and Indians, outlaws and lawmen, Native American lore, and more. With that, let's get into today's story. Most of us know the great Sioux leader known as Sitting Bull, and his role he played in the Indian Wars. But today, I want to look at just where Sitting Bull buried. Sitting Bull had visions of his death, and he said his death would come to the hands by his own people. Let's take a look at what we know is true. On December 15th, 1890, on the Standing Rock Sioux Indian Reservation near Fort Yates Army Post, Indian agent James McLaughlin ordered a group of Indian police to go and arrest Sitting Bull at his home. In Sitting Bull's cabin at the time were his two wives and children. Many of these men in the Indian police force were fellow warriors of Sitting Bull that came to arrest him. Acting under the orders of McLaughlin, the force of 39 Indian policemen and 4 volunteers, one of whom was Sitting Bull's brother-in-law, Gray Eagle, entered the cabin at daybreak on December 15th, which 10 of the Indian police entered, and Lieutenant Bullhead announced to Sitting Bull that they were there to arrest him. Now, this next part comes from the official account filed by James McLaughlin, so you need to kind of read through the lines, so to speak, if you know what I mean. Now, Sitting Bull, he accepted his arrest quietly at first and started getting ready for the journey over to the agency. Well, during which his son, Crowfoot, who was in the house at the time, began to berate his father for accepting the arrest and consenting to go with the Indian police. Whereupon Sitting Bull got stubborn and then refused to accompany the Indian police. By this time he was fully dressed, and the Indian policemen took him outside the house. Now, this is when things get a little different, but again, this is coming from the official report. Upon getting outside, they found themselves completely surrounded by Sitting Bull's followers, all armed and excited. The Indian police reasoned with the crowd, gradually forcing them back, thus increasing the open circle considerably around them. But Sitting Bull kept calling upon his followers to rescue him from the police. He told his followers that if these 2 principal men, Bullhead and Shavehead, were killed, the others would run away. He finally called out for them to start attacking, whereupon Catch the Bear and Strike the Kettle, 2 of Sitting Bull's men, dashed through the crowd and started firing. Now, Bullhead, he was standing on one side of Sitting Bull, and Sergeant Shavehead on the other, while Red Tomahawk came up behind to make sure nothing went down. Catch the Bear bullet struck Bullhead in the right side, and it instantly wheeled and shot Sitting Bull, hitting him in the left side between the 10th and 11th ribs. Now, Strike the Kettle shot, it shot right through Shavehead's abdomen, and all 3 men fell together to the ground. Catch the Bear, who had fired the first shot, was immediately shot down by Private of Police Lone Man, and the fight then became general. In fact, hand-to-hand conflict. 43 policemen and volunteers against 150 crazed ghost dancers. Now, ghost dancers is what the white man called those Native Americans at the time that were building support for a new dawn to the traditional way they used to live and know. It was a dance, a ceremonial dance they were doing, and boy, let me tell you, the Army didn't like it none so-ree. The whole ordeal lasted about 30 minutes and resulted in the death of Sitting Bull and a dozen other Indians. Now, this is where things get really sideways. The body of Sitting Bull was left outside for several days before his death certificate would be signed by the Army doctor. During this time, the doctor cut a lock of Sitting Bull's hair and took his wool leggings. The Army didn't even give Sitting Bull a traditional Lakota burial. Now, it's not clear if the grave that Sitting Bull was placed in didn't include others killed during that fight. The events of the burial are sketchy at best. And that lock of hair and leggings would be turned over to the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. a few years after his death. 15 years go by, and in 1905, 2 white fellers by the names of Fisk and Davies came to Fort Yates to dig up the body of Sitting Bull to collect some souvenirs from him. They spent all night digging with shovels by lantern light, and the 2 white men removed a large bone and rib from the wooden casket they assumed was Sitting Bull's. The 2 men then filled the grave back in and moved on. The gravesite at Fort Yates, North Dakota, would be in peace until 1953, when more people would come in the middle of the night to dig up Sitting Bull. In 1953, a group of citizens from the town of Mobridge, South Dakota, found relatives of Sitting Bull and persuaded them to have his bones removed from Fort Yates, North Dakota, down to Mobridge, mostly done for the marketing to pull in tourists to the area. Yet again, in the middle of the night, a group of men dug up Sitting Bull's remains and moved them south. Now, if you paid attention in science class, you know the human body has over 200 bones in it. Yet only 25 bones were found and moved to South Dakota in 1953. At the Mobridge site, they poured 20 tons of concrete onto Sitting Bull's new grave and had a monument placed on top of the concrete to stop future grave robbers. Yet our story doesn't stop there. We have to take a minute and go back on a report that several Sitting Bull's people took his body shortly after his death and moved it to Canada. Back in the 1880s, Sitting Bull and his people did move to Canada to avoid the U.S. Army, but after about 4 years or so, they moved back on to the Indian reservations of North Dakota. There's a place called Turtle Mountain that is considered a sacred place by the Lakota people. Could they have moved Sitting Bull and prepared a traditional funeral for him at Turtle Mountain? That's a question. In more recent years, the last known living descendant of Sitting Bull is his great-grandson Ernie LaPointe. His grandson has been working to get his grandfather's remains moved from Mobridge to the Little Bighorn battle site. Now remember how I told you that lock of Sitting Bull's hair was cut from his head after his death? Well, that lock of hair was turned over to LaPointe a few years back. While Sitting Bull is credited with the win and death of General Custer and the 7th Cavalry, he wasn't present at the day of the battle. I'd say Sitting Bull was more of a spiritual voice for the battle than a warrior during that time. So where does the body of the great Lakota Sitting Bull lie? By all accounts, one would say that he has returned to the earth. With many of his bones spread out, it seems, and 132 years after his death, what remains there has been turned back to the land. Sitting Bull is all around us today, no matter if you visit the grave marker in North Dakota or South Dakota, or travel to Turtle Mountain up in Canada, or, in the end, if his remains from Mobridge are moved to a sacred spot along the greasy grass of the Little Bighorn. Now, you're probably asking yourself, that doesn't really clear up the situation, and that's part of this little history. We're not sure if old Sitting Bull, if he originally was buried back in 1890 there at the fort, or did his people take his body and do a traditional burial up in Canada at Turtle Mountain? And those grave robbers in 1905, when they took those bones, did they really get old Sitting Bull's bones, or did they grab somebody else's? And in that case, in 1953, when they dug up all the remains over there and took it down to Mobridge, did they truly get Sitting Bull, or did they get somebody else? That is a big secret, and we'll probably never know the answers, but it is a damn good story nonetheless. Well, thank you for listening to today's Old West story. Please take a moment and subscribe to my channel. I would appreciate it if you would share this video with others to help keep the Old West alive for future generations. Until next time.